We have only one reading this morning, and it's taken from the book of Esther, chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes in anguish. Then he dressed in sackcloth, covered his head with ashes, and walked through the city, wailing loudly and bitterly, until he came to the entrance of the palace. He did not go in, because no one wearing sackcloth was allowed inside. Throughout all the provinces, wherever the king's proclamation was made known, there was loud mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, wailed, and most of them put on sackcloth and lay in ashes. When Esther's servant women and the eunuchs told her what Mordecai was doing, she was deeply disturbed. She sent Mordecai some clothes to put on instead of the sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then she called 𝐻𝐻, one of the palace eunuchs appointed as a servant by the king, and told him to go to Mordecai and find out what was happening and why. 𝐻𝐻 went to Mordecai in the city square at the entrance of the palace. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him and just how much money Haman had promised to put into the royal treasury if all the Jews were killed. He gave 𝐻𝐻 a copy of the proclamation that had been issued in Susa, ordering the destruction of Jews. Mordecai asked him to take it to Esther, explain the situation to her, and have her go and plead with the king and beg him to have mercy on a people. 𝐻𝐻 did this, and Esther gave him this message to take back to Mordecai. If anyone, man or woman, goes to the inner courtyard and sees the king without being summoned, that person must die. That is the law. Everyone from the king's advisors to the people in the provinces knows that. There is only one way to get around this law. If the king holds out his gold scepter to someone, then that person's life is spared. But it has been a month since the king sent for me. When Mordecai received Esther's message, he sent her this warning: don't imagine that you are safe than any other Jew just because you are in the royal palace. If you keep quiet at a time like this, help will come from heaven to the Jews, and they will be saved, but you will die, and your father's family will come to an end. Yet, who knows, maybe it was for a time like this that you were made queen. Esther sent Mordecai this reply: go and get all the Jews in Susa together. Hold a fast and pray for me. Don't eat or drink anything for 3 days and nights. My servant woman and I will be doing the same. After that, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. If I must die for doing it, I will die. Mordecai then left and did everything that Esther had told her to do. This is the word of God. May God bless the reading of his word. Amen.
Good morning, everyone. It's again a pleasure to be speaking this morning. I have to apologize. As you can hear, I've got a cold, and I didn't realize, but feel free to wash your hands afterwards, because I've been holding everyone's hands, and I just didn't occur to me that I might be passing on my cold to you. So please wash your hands afterwards. Oh dear. Yeah, as you can see, summer is here. When summer comes, or when winter comes, I usually get a cold, and it so happens that I'm preaching today, and I hope I can still speak after a while. The title of this sermon is His World, and in fact, I was following from Pastor 𝐂𝐭's recent sermons, where he summarized his sermon with, I think it was his church, his people, and I thought, well, okay, I'll do his world today, because we've been reflecting on, of course, how God has built his church, how we are his people, and I'm sure you often wonder, what about the other people? What about the rest of the world? And I think this book here in Esther is a very good example of how God works. This book of Esther is a historical book, and what is remarkable about it is that there is no mention of God at all. In the whole book, 10 chapters, there's no mention of God. But when we read it, you can see God at work. So God doesn't have to be mentioned, but we can see him at work. He is at work in such a remarkable things. I'm also taking the opportunity to share with you what our cell group meetings on Tuesdays, when we studied this recently, we've come up with. So thank you for the cell group members who've been contributing to this. I think it is contributing to this sermon today. So the book of Esther, we read chapter 4, but of course when you read it, you need to think, well, what happened before and what will happen afterwards. So I'll go through some of the key events, because I think they are very interesting. First of all, Esther is a queen, but we can read in the earlier part of the book how she was selected to be the queen. She was selected to be the queen to King 𝐂𝐧𝐧𝐶 of Persia, because the previous queen had disobeyed the king, and she was part of a beauty contest, a year-long beauty treatment, and then at the right time she appeared before the king, and the king chose her to be the next queen among, I'm sure, many other beautiful girls at the time. We are in Babylon. No, maybe not in Babylon, I'm not sure. In Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire at the time. The Persian Empire was very big. So the Persian Empire, it sort of, to the extent of India, okay, to the east, and then all the way down to Africa, to Sudan, middle of Africa. So a big empire. When we say Persian today, we think of Iran, okay? And when we speak of Babylon, where the Jews were taken into captivity some years earlier, many years earlier, we talk Babylon is Iraq, okay? So this is the geographical setting. The time is about 5th century before Christ, some 2,500 years ago. The Jews were taken into captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, but then Babylon was conquered by Persia, and so the new king, King Cyrus, in fact, in his second year after taking over Babylon, decided, and we read that in Ezra, for example, decided to let the Jews go back to Jerusalem. they started to go back. There was rebuilding of the temple, rebuilding of the walls with Nehemiah. Now we are in the time where there are still a lot of Jews in Babylon and throughout the kingdom of Persia. And Esther is a Jew. Her cousin Mordecai is a bit older than her. In fact, when Esther's parents died, Mordecai adopted her as like a child, okay, like her daughter. Although they are cousins, but there's a big age gap. I'm sure you know, in big families, you can have that kind of age gap. So Esther is now the queen. Mordecai is outside the palace. Mordecai has told Esther from the beginning, even when she went to the beauty contest, not to say that she's a Jew. Because, I don't know why, but we can read it afterwards. It's because, probably because of what happened after, which we'll go through. So Mordecai is a Jew as well, but he's got a job in the palace, but outside where the guards are, where, you know, the palace is a big thing, and there's an entrance, and so he's more or less among the king's guards at the time. And we also read about a guy called Haman. Haman is the prime minister at the time, second only to the king. And we read in chapter 3 that Haman was so full of himself, he got the king to say that, you know, whenever he goes, you know, out of the palace, everybody should bow down and kneel in front of him. And Mordecai, who is in the outside the palace, he notices that Mordecai refuses to do that. Doesn't bow down, stays the same, you know, doesn't stand up, just carries on as if he's not there. And that got Haman very angry, furious. Now, why did Mordecai not bow down? We can guess. Again, we don't see God mentioned at all in the book, but he's a Jew. As Jews, they know there's only one God to bow down to. You can't bow down to any other God. And so he did that. And he explained, even though he told Esther not to say she's a Jew, he was happy to tell to the people around him that it's because he's a Jew that he cannot bow down to Haman. And Haman is furious, finds out that he's a Jew. I don't know whether he also had a grudge against the Jews for historical reasons, because Haman comes from the tribe of Amalek. Way back in the Bible, you will see that the Amalekites were the first enemies of Israel as they were moving from Egypt to the Promised Land. They attacked the Jews, and you can read that in the book, I can't remember, I think in Joshua, or anyway, it's there in the history. You can see the Amalekites were enemies of the Israel, and when God told the Israelites to wipe out the Amalekites from the face of the earth, they didn't do it. They killed most of the people, but they left King Agag at the time alive, and Haman is a descendant of King Agag. So I don't know whether he had it at the back of the mind that the Jews are his enemies, and the Jews want to destroy the Amalekites, and if I have a chance, I will destroy them first. So he gets the king to issue an order throughout the empire that the Jews, on a particular day, the 13th day of the month of, I can't remember what it was now, Adar or something like that, he cast lots, and it's called Purim. He cast lots to find out what day should be decreed as the day that everybody could kill the Jews and, you know, take over their possessions. So this edict was issued throughout the land, and when Mordecai hears about it, that's when we start in chapter 4. We see Mordecai is mourning. He puts on sackcloth. He is really, as we see, he's in anguish. His people are under threat of extermination, genocide. And of course, Queen Esther from her palace hears about it, that her cousin and considered like adopting father is wearing sackcloth. And so she says, oh, send these clothes to him and tell him to change his clothes, not to put sackcloth and put new clothes. But Mordecai refused. Mordecai got the message to Esther through, I can't remember the name again, that was difficult. Joe was having difficulty, and I will have difficulty saying his name. Hathach, Hathach was the intermediary between Mordecai and Esther. Mordecai could not go into the temple, into the palace, and Esther, of course, as a queen, was not expected to go down outside. So used Hathach to send messages. So Mordecai got Esther to know that the Jews are under threat of extermination. There's a particular day has been decreed, the 30th day of the month of Adar or something like that. It's coming, and Mordecai says to Esther through the intermediary, better do something about it. Talk to the king, try to get him to change this plan. And Esther sends back a message to say, well, I haven't seen the king for 30 days. I don't know when I'll have an appointment with him, because 30 days might be a long time for a wife not to be called by her husband. But of course, the king had many concubines. It's not surprising. So maybe Esther thought 30 days was a long time. The king didn't think 30 days was a long time. I don't know. But she was not confident that she would be able to speak to the king anytime soon. And we read in this, and this is probably the key verse which I wanted to highlight to you. Mordecai sent Esther this warning. Don't imagine that you are safer than any other Jew just because you're in the royal palace. If you keep quiet at a time like this, help will come from heaven to the Jews, and they will be saved. But you will die, and your father's family will come to an end. Yet, who knows, maybe it was for such a time like this that you were made queen. I think this is a key verse in this book, because Mordecai, and again, God is not mentioned at all, but Mordecai feels that Esther has a key role to play here. She could help to save the Jews, or she could stay quiet. The Jews will be saved anyway. Mordecai says, if you don't help, the Jews will be saved. He doesn't say it, but he's confident that God will save the Jews anyway, with or without her. Because God is God. He believes the promise of God. But he says to Esther, if you don't do anything, you will die. Your parents died early. I look after you, and when you die, nobody in your line will stay. But then he says, who knows? Maybe it was for such a time like this that you were made queen. Maybe Esther, still young, beautiful, and thinks, maybe up to now, and as we know that we also go through this kind of thing. We feel privileged. We are living a luxurious life in the palace, a little bit out of touch with what's going on in the world. Mordecai is telling his cousin Esther, this is the reality. The reality is that our people are under threat, and you can help. And even if you don't help, God will help. He doesn't say that in those words, but it's implied. but maybe you have a role to play. Fortunately, Esther, she respects Mordecai like her father. She knows when Mordecai is saying this, she needs to do something about it. So she gathers up her courage. She says to send a message again to Mordecai to say, look, tell all the Jews in Susa, this is the capital of the Persian Empire, outside, tell them to fast. She doesn't even say pray, but tell them to fast for 3 days for me. Okay, so, and don't eat or drink anything in those 3 days, fasting. Yeah. So she decides to have a go. And we see, read it, but I'll go through it. Fortunately, well, first of all, on the 3rd day after the fasting, she dresses up, she prepares to see the king uninvited. She goes to the palace. Fortunately, I think fortunately, because the king is sitting on his throne, he sees the entrance, he sees Queen Esther there. So in a way, maybe he wasn't offended because, in fact, he just saw Esther outside. Esther was about to sort of ask for the king uninvited, but he sees her. He holds out his golden scepter, which means that she can come in. She can come in, she touches the scepter, and then there's conversation. Fortunately, so then she is able to talk to the king. And the king says, obviously the king sees that she wants to say something, and asks her, what can I do for you? Even up to half my kingdom I can give to you. Up to half my kingdom, we have seen this before, haven't we? We can see that later in John the Baptist, etc. Up to half my kingdom. And Esther doesn't say. Esther just invites them, she says to the king, please get Haman and you, please come to a banquet that I'm organizing this evening. Okay, so she invites Haman and the king to a banquet. Of course, at a banquet, the food is nice, the drinks are flowing. After a while, king says again, what do you want, Esther? What is your request? And again, Esther doesn't say what she wants. She invites them again for another banquet the next day. When Haman goes out of this banquet, he's in high spirits. Of course, he's drunk a lot, eaten a lot, very jolly, thinking, Queen Esther has invited me again, only me and the king, okay, at this banquet. And we're invited again tomorrow. What a wonderful thing. Goes back home, says that to his wife and family and friends. He says, look how great I am. Such privilege. And yet, I will not be happy until the Jews and this Mordecai perish. And I don't know whether his family gives him good advice. But anyway, his family and friends suggest to him, why don't you build a gallows, a high one, they use cubits, I can't remember how many cubits it was, but 75 feet or 23 meters. Imagine 23 meters is higher than this roof. A gallows to hang Mordecai. Why don't you do that? And that night he gets to work, he gets people to build this gallows. And that same night, King Xerxes cannot sleep. I don't know whether he's wondering what Esther wants to ask for. He can't sleep. And what do you do when you can't sleep? You read a good book. He asks his officials to bring the records of the empire, Bring the records, the records of the empire, and read it to me, what happened in the empire in the past days. And they read it to him, and they come up to a story which we can see in Esther in chapter 2, I think, or whatever. Mordecai, before he became a government official, because he was always hanging around looking out for Esther at the time while she was doing her beauty contest, had heard about two of the palace guards plotting against King Xerxes to kill him. And he unveiled that. They managed to find out it was true. They got the two people who were plotting hanged. So when King Xerxes hears about this, he says, this Mordecai, what have we done for him to reward him, for this? The people said, oh, don't remember, don't think we've done anything for him. Maybe except for giving him a job, I don't know, maybe later, in the palace guard. And he says, we need to reward him. And at the same time, Haman comes in. Haman is coming to ask the king for permission to hang Mordecai on the gallows he's built. And he sees Haman and says, hey, Haman, come. Look, I want to reward a person, a man. What do you suggest I do for him? Okay? And Haman's so full of himself, saying, that must be me. Oh, you know what you can do, king? You can give him some of your royal robes to wear, put him on one of your horses, let him go out and go around, and let everybody bow down before him to honor him and say, this is, what happens to when the king is pleased with somebody. And then the king says, okay, do that for Mordecai, his enemy. Oh, he sort of like, okay, comment on dit ça encore? He sort of grins maybe to the side and says, okay, well, I'll have to do that. So he does that. He's furious inside. He wants to kill Mordecai, but he's having to honor him. Anyway, looks forward to the second banquet. So he goes to the second banquet again. Queen Esther treats them well, lots of food, lots of drink. And then the king says again to Esther, look, what is it that you really want? And Esther, instead of saying, cancel this, because you can't cancel a king's order, he sort of appeals to the king and said, I'm very sad. My people are under risk of being killed, and me too. And the king, probably a little bit jolly and very in good mood, and said, why? What's going on? Who's that? Who did that? Who is that? Kill you? Because that's when, in fact, Esther reveals she's a Jew. So Esther now reveals she's a Jew, and she's under the same threat as this order to kill all the Jews. And because Esther is Esther, because she's there as a queen, the king is sympathetic to her. The king could have said, the order's an order. Oh, you're a Jew. It's too bad. But again, Esther was in the right position. God put her there for this purpose, to save the Jews. Eventually, Esther said, because now it's like become personal, who wants to kill you? And then she says, it's this Haman of yours. It's him. He's the vile person who's ordered that. And the king is furious. He goes out, doesn't know what to do now, because his prime minister is being exposed by his queen. Who does he want to follow now? And at the same time, Haman knows he's in trouble, because in fact, when he was sharing with his family, even before going to the banquet again, his family started to realize that, in Creole we say, boulin viré. It means the power has shifted. The power is shifting away from Haman and is going in favor of Mordecai, because when they see Mordecai in the streets wearing the royal robe again, etc., even his family know Haman is in trouble. Mordecai is getting the upper hand. And so Haman knows the king is furious. The king goes out of the room. uh, he pleads with Esther. He sort of kneels down, and Esther is on the couch or something in the banquet, and he kneels down and is pleading for his life. When the king comes in, he says, "Oh, you want to rape my wife as well now?" And orders him to, in fact, we see in the story, the king's officials, the eunuchs, start putting a cloth on the head of Haman. They know he's going to be killed. They put a cloth on his head already. And he goes, and in fact, he's hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. All this to say, and I'm sure I could go on a bit more on this. I encourage you to read it. I hope I have said enough for you to say, let me read the book of Esther again, because it's fascinating how God works even in people who do not believe in him. And I think this is really the message I wanted to put across today. We are in a time now, in a few weeks' time, people of Mauritius will be going to vote for the next government. Sometimes when we look at government or even in any other politician, we despair because we don't think they're good enough. But then when we read the book of Esther, we know that God can work even though he's not mentioned. God will not be mentioned too much in this political campaign and all the things. God will be mentioned, but just to be able to win votes, not much more than that. But we need to pray. It is his world and his country here and the future of the people here that is at stake. Are we going to have a new government, whichever way it is, that will really care for the people and don't do silly laws like exterminate so many people? And then, because in the end here in Esther, the way to go around this law of killing the Jews on a particular day, the king could not go against that. But he added another law. The Jews were allowed to arm themselves to defend themselves. So instead of canceling the order, which they can't do, he adds another law that the Jews can defend themselves. And in the end, the Jews were able to defend themselves on the 13th day of this month of Adar, or whatever it was called, and the 14th day extra for Susa. We see that Esther asked for an extra day to be able to fight back against the people who wanted to kill the Jews. And these are now, these are now celebrated by the Jews every year, the festival of Purim, for 2 days. So going back to us today, what does this story tell us? The story tells us many things. Among them, God is at work even though we don't care or we don't think about him. He is at work. He cares for people. He uses people even in their weakness. Esther could have said, no, I'm afraid of all my life, but she had the courage to do what she must have felt God telling her to do through her cousin Mordecai. Mordecai himself had taken a stand for God by refusing to bow down to Haman. We are called to take a stand for God as well. There are some things we can't do, even if it's law. We can't do because God is greater. So we need to have the courage to do what God wants from us, even if it's against the rest of the world. And so I think it's a big encouragement for us. And I would also encourage you to think about whether you could be like Esther today. God is calling you to do something. You're a bit afraid. You're not sure. But think about those words. Maybe you were born for such a time like this. Maybe we are called to be the people we are today to do something for God.